The Gerblin's been swinging a hot bat of late, 7 for his last 15. Here's the 2-1. Deep to left. That ball is gone. The crowd loves it. I've never heard this much generic goblin noise.
Hey gang, and welcome back. Just so you know, you can use the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, one word, at FlipsideGaming.com to get 10% off orders $10 or more. You can also use the promo code at Original Magic Art on everything except for paintings. And finally, you can use the code at mtg.multizone.ca to get 10% off of your orders of singles. Using the code will help you save some money and help out the channel at the same time. Hey gang, and welcome back. As I'm sure you saw in the thumbnail, we have two brand new spanking commanders from Modern Horizons. First up, we have Max playing Yawgmoth, keeping 2 Swamps, an Ever-Flowing Chalice, Astral Cornucopia, Gonti, Phyrexian Reclamation, and Bitter Blossom. Martin has built first Sliver, and he's keeping City of Brass, 2 Mountains, Fury Sliver, Sandstep Citadel, Maelstrom Nexus, and Shadow of the Grave. Nick is playing his Ravos and Vial Smasher deck, keeping Inventor's Fair, Rakdos Signet, Benevolent Offering, Dragonskull Summit, Protector of the Crown, Shadowblood Ridge, and City of Brass. New to the channel and commander is Tarek playing his Yuriko deck, and he keeps an Island, Memorial to Folly, Hall of the Bandit Lord, Misdirection, Nether Trader, and Smoke Shroud. Max wins the die roll and starts us off. Max plays a Swamp and casts Phyrexian Reclamation. Tarek plays a tap Memorial to Folly, passing. Nick plays a tap Dragonskull Summit and passes. Martin plays a tap Sandstep Citadel and he passes to Max. Max plays another Swamp and kicks an Ever-Flowing Chalice once. Tarek plays an Island and he casts Portent. He rearranges his top 3 and draws on Nick's upkeep. Nick plays a Shadowblood Ridge, casts Rakdos Signet, who needs white mana. Martin plays a Mountain and passes. Max plays a Swamp and he pays 3, 1 into each X for his Astral Cornucopia. Martin responds to this with an Enlightened Tutor, and Max then drops Bitter Blossom before passing. Tarek plays a Hall of the Bandit Lord, which comes in tapped, and he drops Jace's Phantasm. He then passes to Nick, and Martin decides on a Chromatic Lantern, putting to the top of his library. Nick plays a City of Brass, and he brings out Vial Smasher. Martin plays a Mountain and casts Chromatic Lantern. Max loses 1 life to Bitter Blossom, and he plays a Blasting Zone as his land for turn. He then casts his commander, Yawgmoth, and passes to Tarek, remembering at the end of turn his new land should have a counter on it. Tarek draws and plays an Isolated Watchtower. He swings his Phantasm at Nick, who can't block it, and before damage is dealt, he has Yuriko Commander Ninjutsu in for the Phantasm, dealing 1. Tarek then gets to reveal off the top, and he shows a land, dealing no extra damage. At the end of turn, Nick casts Enlightened Tutor this time, taking 1 from the City of Brass. He resolves Vial Smasher's trigger first, dealing 1 to Martin. Nick then goes to grab a black market and puts it on top. Nick draws and plays Inventor's Fair. He then pays 5 to cast a black market, and with the enchantment on the stack, Max sacrifices a fairy to Yawgmoth. He puts a -1/-1 counter on Vial Smasher, loses a life, and draws a card. Nick then resolves a Vial Smasher trigger, and once again rolls to hit Martin, but this time for 5. Martin's turn is speedy as he plays a Forest and casts Maelstrom Nexus. He passes, and at the end of turn, Max activates Yawgmoth's ability, discarding Nether Trader to proliferate. This lets Max add a counter to basically everything on the field he wants, except for Black Market. Max loses 1 on his upkeep to gain a fairy, and he plays a Swamp and swings Yawgmoth at Nick. In his second main phase, he casts Gonti, targeting Nick as well. He takes 1 card from Nick's top 4, and bottoms Nick's remaining cards in a random order. Tarek plays an Island and loses 2 life to the Hall of the Bandit Lord to help cast a Hasty Ninja of Deep Hours. He swings both of them at Martin, sadly revealing 2 lands from Yuriko's triggers, and then draws from the Ninja of the Deep Hours. He recasts Jace's Phantasm, and remembers he could have returned his Smoke Shroud when the ninja re-entered. The table is fine with him rewinding a little bit, and he attaches it to the Ninja of Deep Hours. Nick untaps and gains some black mana from his market. He taps out, taking 1 from the City of Brass to cast a Protector of the Crown. With that on the stack, Vial Smasher triggers, and Nick rolls to see who he shall hit. Tarek is the target this time, taking 6. The Protector then enters, making Nick the Monarch. Nick then plays Bojuka Bog and targets Max's graveyard. With the ability on the stack, Max sacrifices his fairy token to give the Ninja of Deep Hours a -1/-1 counter, and pays the 1 black to bring back his Nether Trader. He loses 1 life and draws a card from Yawgmoth's ability, and Nick gains another counter on his black market. And moving to his end step, Nick draws a card. Martin plays his own City of Brass and casts the first Sliver. He gets 2 Cascades, hitting Sensei's Divining Top and Darksteel Ingot. Martin then drops a Heart Sliver, only getting to Cascade once now. He goes deep until he hits Virulent Sliver, getting to cast it. To save us a few minutes of time, Martin reveals until he hits Living End, but decides not to cast it, and shuffles all the cards in a random order to the bottom of his library. At the end of turn, Max pays with his Astral Cornucopia to activate Yawgmoth's second ability, discarding a Mind Stone to proliferate. Max then sacrifices the Trader to Yawgmoth, putting a -1/-1 counter on Yuriko, and loses a life and draws a card, with Nick gaining a counter on his black market. Max then sacrifices Gonti to Yawgmoth as well, putting a counter on the Protector this time, and also pays the 1 to bring the Trader back. Max loses 1 in his upkeep to Bitter Blossom, gaining a fairy token, and plays a swamp in his main phase. He casts Nick's card, Thunderstaff, and activates his Phyrexian Reclamation to lose 2 life and return Gonti to his hand. He casts Gonti, and this time targets Tarek with the Gonti trigger. He takes 1 of the top 4, and then passes. Tarek draws for turn, and plays a swamp. Moving to combat, Tarek swings Jace's Phantasm and Ninja of Deep Hours at Martin. Martin, being unable to block the Phantasm, means that Tarek gets to ninjutsu in a Throat Slitter, who upon entering, kills Martin's Heart Sliver. Martin then takes 3, and a bunch of triggers go on the stack for Tarek. Before resolving any of them though, he casts Long-Term Plans, and tutors for a card and puts it 3rd from the top. He then draws from the Ninja of Deep Hours, and then reveals the next 2 cards from Yuriko's ability triggering twice. He shows another island, and Temporal Trespass, dealing 11 to his opponents. Tarek then discards down to 7, passing to Nick. Nick draws for turn and gains 4 black mana, playing a mountain in his main phase. He loses 1 life to the City of Brass, which actually gets redirected to his Protector of the Crown. This is for Ravos, who hits the stack, and has Tarek taking 5 from the Vial Smasher trigger once more. Nick then casts a Boros Signet, and passes, drawing at the end of turn. Martin uses his top on his upkeep to help set up a good draw. He plays an unclaimed territory, naming Slivers, and he casts Fury Sliver. He hits Greater Good, and then a Horned Sliver, sadly forgetting to cascade off the Sliver. Moving to combat, Martin swings the first Sliver at Max. Before moving to the blocker step, Max sacrifices the Nether Trader to Yawgmoth, putting a counter onto the Fury Sliver, losing a life and drawing a card. Max then floats 3 black mana with the Astral Cornucopia, and sacrifices the Fairy token to Yawgmoth as well. Please bear in mind, Nick is keeping on top of this for his black market. Max puts another counter onto the Fury Sliver, and loses 1 life and draws a card, and pays the 1 black to bring back his Nether Trader. With the 2 floating black, Max then discards City of Shadows to Yawgmoth's second ability and proliferates, but forgets to proliferate onto the Fury Sliver. Realizing his mistake, Max sacrifices the Nether Trader again to put a -1/-1 counter on the Fury Sliver. He then blocks with Gonti, and with Gonti having Death Touch and the first Sliver no longer having Trample, Martin sacrifices it to Greater Good, drawing 7 and discarding 3. He then passes. Max loses a life and gains a Fairy token. He draws for turn and plays a swamp. Moving to combat, he swings Yawgmoth at Tarek for 2, who can't block thanks to Yawgmoth's protection from humans. Max's second main phase has him casting Grave Pact, and he passes to Tarek. Tarek draws for turn and plays an island. We see a telling time to help set up his next combat step, with Tarek putting 1 to hand, 1 on top, and 1 on the bottom. While that may have been easy, connecting with a ninja is an entirely different matter though, and Tarek passes knowing fully well that if he tries to attack, Max will mess with his stuff. Nick draws and gains a cool 8 black mana. He taps his City of Brass, redirecting the damage to the Protector, and he casts Ghostly Prison. He then drops a Scab Clan Berserker and makes a deal with Martin to have him take the hit for 2. Martin agrees and takes it, and the Scab Clan gains a +1/+1 counter from the Renown ability. Nick then passes, drawing at the end of turn. Martin draws and plays a command tower for turn. He brings back out the first Sliver, which at this point is more like his 6th Sliver, and he cascades twice, first hitting Fact or Fiction. He takes the pile from Nick with 4 cards, and cascades into the new anime version of Vivian. Martin then downticks Vivian and sets aside a card, and he discards down to 7. In the meantime, Max sacrifices Gonti to put a -1/-1 counter on the Berserker, effectively countering its +1/+1 counter, and he loses a life and draws a card. This in turn triggers Grave Pact, with Max's opponent sacrificing a creature. Max brings back the Nether Trader as Gonti goes to the yard, and sacrifices it as soon as it returns to put more counters on the Protector and make his opponent sacrifice another creature. With the Pact trigger on the stack though, Nick casts Benevolent Offering, but Max counters it with a stolen Force of Negation that he'd taken from Tarek. Max then sacrifices the Fairy, putting another counter on the Protector, who sacrificed the Grave Pact trigger anyway, and he loses a life and draws a card. With the creature dying, Max then repays for his Nether Trader. Martin also decides to sacrifice the first Sliver again to greater good, branding his commander and drawing 7 and discarding 3. Max plays a Westvale Abbey as his land for turn, and taps his 2 rocks to make 8 mana. He uses 6 for Nirkana Revenant, and needs only to tap Swamp and use 2 floating mana to cast Sifter of Skulls. Max then remembers to gain a fairy token from the Bitter Blossom and loses a life from it as well. Moving to combat, Max swings Yawgmoth at Nick and the Nether Trader at Martin. Before moving to blockers, Martin casts Brainstorm and cascades from his Nexus until he hits Living End. Max responds to this by casting a Dictate of Erebos and sacrifices his Nirkana Revenant, putting a counter on his Sifter, losing a life and drawing a card to Yawgmoth. He does it again with the Trader and gains more Eldrazi tokens and draws a card and loses a life. Max then pays 2 black mana to discard Massacre Worm to Yawgmoth's ability, Proliferating, while Nick keeps adding those counters to his black market. Max then loses his creatures and puts 4 triggers from both the Dictate and the Pact on the stack after resolving Living End. With the triggers on the stack, Martin taps his Sliver team to help cast Court of Calling to find an answer. He grabs his Sliver Legion, which will help him against the Massacre Worm trigger of -2/-2, but won't do much against the packs. Martin then sacrifices the first Sliver to greater good, drawing 17 cards and losing 2 life to the Massacre Worm. He discards 3 tapped lands, and still hasn't drawn an answer, and sacrifices another huge Sliver to draw more cards and loses another 2 life. We then see him do it again, digging even deeper and losing 2 more. Martin then decides to cast Entomb and goes to find a Dregscape Sliver, mostly just for fun. Martin knows when he's done for, and he sacrifices his Sliver Legion and another Sliver to take himself out of the game on his own terms. Tarek and Nick then lose their boards to the Pact triggers, with Nick losing 4 and Tarek losing 6 respectively. We then move from Max's combat step, of all things, and he passes turn. Tarek draws for turn and plays an island, casting Ponder. He rearranges the top 3 and puts them back before drawing 1. We then see the All-Star of Jace's Phantasm hitting the field, and he passes to Nick. Nick draws for turn and gains a whopping 26 black mana in his main phase, which seems kinda good. He's easily able to replay both of his commanders, and he plays a Buried Ruin. Nick then casts the All-Star, Smothering Tithe, because he needs more mana, and he passes to Max. Max loses a life and gains a token to the Bitter Blossom trigger, and he then gets a Flavor Win of the Century by casting Yawgmoth's Vial Offering, targeting the Phantasm and Yawgmoth in his graveyard. Tarek gets super down with this, and uses a Familiar's Ruse, bouncing the Phantasm back to his hand and countering the spell. Unfortunately, this leaves him wide open, and Max then pays 2 more life to return Yawgmoth to his hand. He recasts his commander, and then pays 5 mana to the Westvale Abbey, sacrificing 5 creatures to it, and transforms the land into Ormondal Profane Prince, which might be the first time I think he's ever happened on this channel. He also gains some Eldrazi tokens from the Sifter seeing creatures dying, and moving to combat, he swings the Demon Prince and the Revenant, pumping the Revenant 4 times. This is enough to take Tarek out, and Max passes. At the end of turn, Nick cracks his Inventor's Fair to find an artifact. He grabs an Orbs of Warding, putting it to hand, and moving to his turn. Nick draws for turn, and gains an absurd amount of black mana from the market, easily paying for the Orbs of Warding. He recasts his commanders again, and passes. At the end of turn, he draws a card while Max pays to discard 2 cards to Yawgmoth, proliferating twice. Max plays a Swamp and activates Blast Zone, destroying all permanents that cost 3, and remembers then to lose his 1 and gain a fairy. He sacrifices one of the Eldrazi token for a colorless mana, which forces Nick to sacrifice his creatures. Moving to combat, Max swings for lethal, pumping the Nurkana Revenant enough to get around the orbs, reducing some of the damage. As my voice still hasn't fully recovered, I'm only going to talk about the winning deck. In this case, it was Yawgmoth. I think the designers have done a fantastic job coming up with a great mono-black commander who does a bit of everything. Using Yawgmoth's first ability, even though it costs you 1 life, still provides you with a ton of value. With a guaranteed card draw, and potentially moving a creature, or at least depowering one, you really can't ask for much more, but we still get some. There's also the fantastically on-theme Proliferate ability, and it only costs you 2 black and discarding a card, which is a real bargain. As illustrated by Max's deck list, the fact that we have Draw, Removal, and Proliferate in the command zone allows us to run some interesting cards that typically wouldn't see play in other cases. Astral Cornucopia has always been a card on my radar, but the 3 X's to be able to make 1 mana seems very steep. But when you're able to proliferate and keep adding counters to it, it's not as bad. Same goes for Everflowing Chalice. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/MTGMudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/MTGMudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.